Hey guys, so this is going to be your Chapter 13 webinar. Going to try to keep it short and sweet for you guys. Hopefully you had a wonderful Thanksgiving. We will discuss this chapter on Tuesday when we get back, and then we'll write an essay on it, and then we're going to move right on to Chapter 14. So this chapter is really social in nature. It's kind of a hodgepodge of different things that are going on in the 19th century, so we can just get through it really quickly. So one of the first things you're going to notice in the 19th century is the dramatic increase in population, and you're going to see population spread increasingly west. A lot of this is because of the transportation revolution that's taking place. So in addition to steam power, which is very prominent in the earlier parts of the 19th century, particularly with the completion of the Erie Canal, you are going to see increasing railroad transportation beginning in the 1830s, but really spreading increasingly once we get to 1850. We will talk about how the beginning of the Transcontinental Railroad is going to increasingly add to sectional tension. But this map sort of indicates what is happening, particularly in the Midwest. You can see areas like Chicago really virtually non-existent in terms of population by 1820. By the time 1860 rolls around, Chicago is a very large city. And instant cities like Utica, Chicago, they are going to be transportation centers. Utica is along the Erie Canal, and Chicago, obviously, a major railroad city. But one of the additional factors that's going to contribute to the increase in population is going to be more immigration. So you see a large representation of Irish and German immigration. They are certainly a new labor population. The Irish population tends to stay on the eastern seaboard, but then you're going to see increasing German immigration into the Midwest areas. The Irish are immigrating mainly because of the potato famine that took place in the 1840s and 1850s. And the German population, they some of them made up more skilled labor populations. You're also going to see an increasing number of Chinese immigrants into the California areas in the wake of the gold rush. All of these groups are going to experience a certain degree of discrimination. You're going to see a wide gap between the rich and the poor. And also the development of ethnic enclaves. These pictures here demonstrate some tenement housing, particularly in the New York City area. You see that a large number of people occupy very small dwellings. These oftentimes were just one-room areas, no sanitation systems to speak of. And as these neighborhoods develop, really only the wealthiest of the wealthy have any type of sanitation system whatsoever. So when I say sanitation, ultimately disposal of waste was something that simply was not part of a residential area in poor residential neighborhoods. So ultimately no real running water, plumbing, anything to speak of. These ethnic enclaves or ghettos that develop concentrate some of the poorest populations. They are crime-ridden. They are certainly dirtier. They tend to be centered around language groups in particular. They were, to a certain extent, also self-chosen in the sense that immigrants wanted to live in areas where they spoke a common language, where they shared a common cultural tradition. But these ghettos, so to speak, certainly developed also because of the wealth disparities that existed. The development of popular culture, or kind of how people spent their leisure time, was one thing that tended to plague and challenge the middle class. You saw that the poorer sort of groups that made up a subculture tended to congregate around tavern and theater cultures, as well as the penny press, very cheap newspaper, and also one that ultimately catered more towards a poor population. That different businesses oftentimes discriminated against certain ethnic groups more than others. The Irish population and the African American population in particular was segregated, and this is sort of something that a lot of people don't realize, is that the Irish population and the Italian as well as Jewish population was not considered white upon their initial immigration. That the middle class in particular is sort of frightened of these ethnic groups. The working class was often seen as a rowdy and drunk bunch, and so you saw this discrimination continue throughout periods of the 19th century. Catholics also experienced quite a bit of discrimination. You do see a widening concentration of free blacks living in the cities in the north. They face different residential segregation, so they too live in their own sort of segregated ghettos. They were discriminated against when they were looking for certain jobs. When we talk about the development of schooling later, we're going to see continued segregating schools. And they ultimately try to develop their own communities. They publish their own newspapers. They have their own types of churches. They even develop their own types of businesses. And we will talk about anti-slavery movements a little bit later in the chapter. So some of them also will become very involved in those movements. Early labor unions were one way that the working class tried to organize in order to sort of have their own protection in their work, and at the same time attempt to discriminate against other groups. The Working Men's Party was one of the earliest connections between politics as well as organized labor. This was a very short-lived political party. As you can see, this advertisement is targeting against the Chinese in particular. This is a political advertisement in California that argues that if you are organized around the Working Men's Party, your job will be protected over Chinese laborers who tended to work for much less money. Even though the Working Men's Party was short-lived, you do see other general trade unions start to develop, but even these unions were really not organized and did not have enough numbers to really protect any type of stable or well-paying job. And the Panic of 1837, which is characterized by widespread unemployment. The unemployment rate in certain areas was as high as 25%. This sort of collapses all different types of trade unions that had developed because of the desperation for jobs. The earliest unions still were comprised predominantly of white men, and they did serve to segregate against other groups of laborers. You're also going to see the development of machine party politics. Ultimately, this cartoon sort of represents a political boss. So this giant man that's represented in this cartoon is a political machine. Ultimately, a party boss is someone who tries to organize a group, an electorate, in order to secure their votes. They try to appeal directly for working class voters. They argue that they represent the urban poor's needs. But ultimately, these groups are very corrupt. They mainly promise certain things to the working poor only to secure their votes. They try to guarantee jobs, but most of the time after the election, these jobs are not guaranteed and not protected any more than others. So the machine party politics that you see developing in the 19th century is not really any type of political improvement, nor does it really represent the political needs of the poor. It's just one way to sort of take advantage of a low-paying electorate group, and you will see this sort of continue to develop as a manipulation of a certain group of voting people. So other social reform movements, you're going to see the Second Great Awakening, to a large extent, is going to drive many of these social reform movements. The idea that certain middle-class communities in particular are trying to respond to developments of the market revolution. One thing that you see is that larger-scale reforms are often the goals of these social reform movements. The idea that the population must be protected by some of the corrupting forces of the market revolution. One of the things you see develop very early on is a demand for much more organized compulsory education. The Massachusetts education system was the first to be totally organized, and it was, again, a compulsory education system, which means that every child, every citizen was meant to go to a public school. The Horace Mann public schools in Massachusetts was one of the first models of a completely tax-supported system. So ultimately, your tax revenues were meant to completely fund education for all children. This was actually seen as an alternative to child labor as well as child prisons. So these education systems were certainly seen as an alternative for a more corrupt way to manage the young population. Realized that there were not any types of well-organized child labor reform efforts at the beginning of the 19th century. So it was very common for children actually to be working in factories for very low pay. So school was definitely seen as an alternative to what they could end up in. The temperance movement was also incredibly popular. It was made up predominantly by women at first, women who argued that alcohol was one of the large-scale sources of corruption, that oftentimes male workers would spend the majority of their pay on alcohol consumption in the taverns, that oftentimes men who were under the influence of alcohol would contribute to larger scale family problems. So this picture of temperance leaders in the 19th century shows that women actually would argue that if their husbands would use alcohol, if their husbands would drink, that ultimately they would not have any sort of comfort from their wives. You can sort of joke around that some of these women look a little bit homely, and so maybe the effectiveness of this advertisement was not as good as some others. Some working class members also join the temperance movement, especially in the wake of the Panic of 1837. And by the 1840s, you do see alcohol consumption actually decrease by quite a bit. There are also efforts to fight prostitution, which continues to develop as a source of female employment. Ultimately, even though this was seen as a corrupt way of life, it tended to pay quite well, and some women who found themselves in lower paying jobs such as domestic employment or factory employment made less money than women who prostituted. And efforts to thwart or sort of fight against prostitution actually had much less success than the temperance movement in general. You're also going to see a woman named Dorothea Dix, who is responsible for the organization and improvement in the treatment of the mentally insane. So Horace Island movement in the 19th century actually was seen as quite successful. Obviously, there will be continuing medical developments and improvements in the treatment of the insane in the future, but ultimately Dorothea Dix was the woman who was credited with treating the insane not as criminals, but as people who were actually mentally ill. You're also going to see, and this is sort of why this chapter is so random, a development of certain utopian communities, and many of them were religious in nature, but some of them were also seen as different experiments with how to develop a community and its economy. So the Millerites and the Shakerites were seen as religious in nature predominantly. This is a sort of this is a representation of the Shakers, who actually organized around their belief that there was an upcoming apocalypse. Shakers actually practiced celibacy, and they believed that their community was completely equal. But the problem with the Shakers was a community that practiced celibacy obviously could not perpetuate itself. So the Shakers obviously were a short-lived movement. You also see experiments with socialism. So a community in Indiana that was founded by a man named Robert Owen developed a community called New Harmony in Indiana, which was meant to ultimately experiment with a socialist community. And this also was a relatively short-lived effort, but it did attract a certain number of migrants to sort of experiment with a different way of living in the wake of the corruption brought on by the market revolution. You also see other religious movements. The most prominent was the Mormon settlement, which actually originated in upstate New York, but because the Mormons, partly because of their belief in a complex marriage or polygamy, was something that experienced a large-scale degree of persecution. Joseph Smith, the founder of the Mormon community, ultimately, he and the other Mormons ultimately find a better community for themselves after migrating quite a large distance, and a large scale group of their population settles in the Salt Lake City area. But you also see many of them end up in California. There's actually still quite a large representation of Mormons living in California, but you'll sort of see the Mormon diaspora represented on this map. Okay. So the anti-slavery movement, realized that the anti-slavery movement doesn't really kick in until the 1830s. Remember that the international slave trade was abolished by 1808, and by the 1820s and 1830s, you're going to see continued questions about what is going to happen with the future of slavery in the United States. The anti-slavery movement took many different forms, some of which were more well-known than others. And so one of the first alternatives to slavery was the colonization movement. And this ultimately believed that even though there should be emancipation of the enslaved population, that they could never assimilate back into American culture. And so a colony was developed in Liberia, in Africa, that was meant to sort of resettle the African population, or African American population at that point, after emancipation. And so some people actually did resettle in this area, but the much more well-known abolition movement was, I guess, developed in 1831 initially with William Lloyd Garrison's publication of his newspaper, The Liberator, which was his newspaper that ultimately demanded immediate abolition, which was actually not very popular at the time. So William Lloyd Garrison, he was a very religious man, ultimately was inspired to publish this newspaper that was very religious in nature. He argued that the only way that slave owners could get any sort of religious repentance was to completely abolish slavery. And even though William Lloyd Garrison lived in Massachusetts, so an area that clearly did not have many slaves by the 1830s, his beliefs were not at all popular, and he did face lynch mobs, and you'll see that there were other anti-slavery members who were not nearly as lucky as Garrison, especially the Reverend Lovejoy, who ultimately was killed because of his abolitionist beliefs. Other important abolitionist people to keep in mind, Frederick Douglass, who's represented here in the left, he was a slave who escaped, and then sort of just as a political and social statement, eventually uses money that he makes as a free man to purchase his freedom from his former master. He founded his own newspaper that was called the North Star, and he was a very, very talented and well-known orator throughout the 19th century. He became famous because of his participation in the Seneca Falls Convention, which we'll talk about in a little while. So he sort of marries the abolition movement and the women's rights movement. But he also eventually befriends, or he eventually at least makes an acquaintance with President Lincoln, and is responsible for many of Lincoln's political decisions when he is president, such as the Emancipation Proclamation, and also he pushed Lincoln to allow black men to fight for the Union Army during the Civil War. Also represented in the upper right is John Quincy Adams, who was in Congress during this time period. He was president, if you remember, but he actually is just a House representative for Massachusetts when the gag rule is put before the table of Congress, which essentially existed until 1844. It existed from 1836 to 1844, which effectively tabled any effort to discuss abolition before Congress. And John Quincy Adams, as a member of Congress, actually fights against the gag rule and is able to get it repealed by 1844. You're going to see that the abolition movement does actually split at certain moments in its history. in many ways, it splits along racial lines. There are certain people that favor gradual abolition rather than immediate abolition because of the sort of dramatic overthrow that immediate abolition would have on the economy of the South. Frederick Douglass actually breaks with William Lloyd Garrison at one point because of the political action that Garrison's abolition movement sort of takes on. There are different political parties that develop around the cause of abolition. You're going to see the Liberty Party form, which eventually will... I do not have a picture of the Liberty Party. My apologies, I thought I did. The Liberty Party, which is going to form as an abolition party. You'll also see the Free Soil Party develop in the 1850s, and eventually you will see the development of the Republican Party, which we'll talk about in a later chapter, which takes on a combination of a large-scale federal government as well as the anti-slavery cause. Last thing on the agenda is the women's rights movement, which culminates with the Seneca Falls Convention in 1848. So realize that the women's rights movement develops actually earlier than 1848, obviously. It develops in the 1830s. And a lot of this happens because women want to have a position, they want to have a voice in the abolition movement. And actually there was an anti-slavery organization, an anti-slavery convention in the 1830s in London that many prominent American women attended. Lucretia Mott and Elizabeth Cady Stanton actually made the journey with their husbands to go to this convention, but they were not allowed to sit on the actual floor of the convention. They had to sit at the balcony because these meetings were segregated by gender. And it comes to certain people's attention, notably Frederick Douglass's attention, that these women are unable to directly participate in these organizations. And Douglass is very upset at the segregation, and actually he attends the Seneca Falls Convention in 1848, one of the only prominent males that actually attends this convention. So the convention that really puts women on the map as female activists does not take place until Seneca Falls in 1848. Upstate New York, very small, sort of obscure town, but nonetheless, approximately 300 women participate in this movement. Again, Lucretia Mott, Elizabeth Cady Stanton are present. Also, Sarah and Angelina Grimke, two prominent abolitionist sisters from South Carolina, participate in this as the first major female public speakers in American history. The major written document that results from this convention is the Declaration of Sentiments, which is worded very similarly to the Declaration of Independence. However, the Declaration of Sentiments says, we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men and women are created equal. And also there's a declaration of grievances against men rather than the king. So that's another way that it is different. But this really sort of I guess, is seen as the historical beginning of the women's rights movement in the United States. And it's really one of the only major landmark moments on the timeline, the mainstream timeline of U.S. history, where we see a major contribution to the women's rights movement. We'll see this obviously pick up more headway after the Civil War. Really, the women's rights movement, even though the Declaration of Sentiments is a major accomplishment, when the Civil War breaks out, women kind of take the back burner socially and politically to the cause of abolition, as well as the cause of preserving the Union when the Civil War really gets underway. So we kind of table women's activism to a large extent, even though it sort of takes off in this time period. So major themes to consider throughout this chapter, obviously the connection between women's rights and the abolition movement. We'll see a continuing element of tension between the rich and the poor classes. We'll definitely see continued reform efforts that develop as a result of increasing urbanization and immigration. We'll talk about how the immigrant group experiences the war, and also how certain economic experiments like socialism will definitely develop also in the later periods in the 19th century. But ultimately, this chapter, again, is sort of a hodgepodge of different social developments. And we can talk about some of these major major themes socially, economically, in our discussion on Tuesday. So not a very long chapter. Hopefully I didn't torture you too much, and we'll talk about this on Tuesday. So again, happy Thanksgiving, and I'll see you all soon. Take care.